Well, good morning, everyone. And this is the penultimate sermon in our sermon series, which started all the way back after Trinity Sunday. It's taken us all over the summer period. And we've had a couple of weeks break because of harvest. But today and next week, we're finishing off our sermon series, Christ-centered and Jesus-shaped. So just a reminder that this sermon series really was as a result of the new 10-year vision for the Church of England as published by our Archbishop of York, Stephen Cottrell. And this 10-year vision is really about the need for us as churches to refocus on Jesus. And if that seems obvious, we are Christian churches, we should be constantly focused on Jesus, but it's amazing how we can become distracted by other things. A really good book that's come out recently and refers to this new 10-year vision, apart from anything else, is a book called Rewilding the Church by Steve Aisthorpe. And you might think from the title it's all about, the ecology and the environment. It kind of is, but it's applying the principles of managing the land well to how we do church and how we are church. So it's a very, very interesting read indeed. And there's a particular chapter that talks about the importance of key species inhabiting certain parts of the land. And the argument is that, obviously, when it comes to the church, the key species is Jesus himself. Jesus needs to be absolutely first and forefront and uppermost in all that the church does. And Steve Aisthorpe writes this, with reference to that wonderful verse in Hebrews, which says, "Let us keep our eyes fixed on Jesus, on whom our faith depends from beginning to end." In reference to that verse, he writes, "We never outgrow the need to refocus on our Saviour. Without it, self seizes control and Jesus becomes a pastime, Lord in name only." And the great biblical scholar and translator Eugene Peterson wrote that when we take our eyes off Jesus, humility begins to recede as competence increases, and we run the risk of ending up as bosses on behalf of Jesus rather than followers of Jesus. So the need to keep Jesus firmly in our sights and to be Christ-centered, and through being Christ-centered to become Jesus-shaped, or to make sure we stay Jesus-shaped and become even more Jesus-shaped in all that we are and all that we do. So over our sermon series, we focused on Jesus in the Gospel of Mark and for a few weeks in John chapter 6 as well. And we've reminded ourselves of many aspects of Jesus' amazing life and amazing ministry. We've seen Jesus as the healer. We've seen Jesus as the breaker of tradition, as the Messiah, as the ordinary and the extraordinary, as the bread of life, as the compassionate one, as the despised and rejected, as the communicator, as the Son of Mary, stiller of storms, the strong Son of God. We've also seen him as one whose mind was changed by the faith of a foreign woman, and also one, most recently, who similarly encourages us to be inclusive and merciful and kind in all of our relationships. Today, we add another very important word to that list, that big list of all those different aspects, all those different descriptors of Jesus that we've encountered once again. And that word is servant. Jesus said, "For even the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve and to give his life as a ransom for many. And behind these words, and I'm sure James and John would have understood this in the conversation that they were having with Jesus. Behind these words is almost certainly one of the most famous passages of the Old Testament, namely Isaiah chapter 53, some of which we have been treated to today as our Old Testament reading. Isaiah chapter 53 is an extraordinary passage. It is one of several passages in the second half of Isaiah that describes a mysterious figure referred to as God's servant. This figure may represent the nation of Israel, as Israel reflects on its experience of exile and emerges from that experience of exile, or the servant figure may represent some kind of Messiah figure. But as Christians, when we read Isaiah chapter 53, we cannot fail to recognize Jesus, the ultimate servant of God. And even though these prophecies were written down hundreds of years before the life of Jesus, so many details from Jesus' own life can be found in this most famous of Isaiah's servant songs. There is, for example, the servant's close identification with illness and sickness as a healer. Surely he has borne our infirmities and carried our diseases, verse 4. The song also mentions a gross miscarriage of justice, such as the one experienced by Jesus. By a perversion of justice, he was taken away. Who could have imagined his future? Verse 8. There is the servant's silence before his accusers, which reminds us of Christ's silence before Pilate. He was oppressed and he was afflicted, yet he did not open his mouth. Like a lamb that is led to the slaughter, and like a sheep that before its shearers is silent, so he did not open his mouth. Other amazing details. The servant's death is mentioned. The servant dies the death of the wicked, but is buried in a rich person's tomb. Verse 9, they made his grave with the wicked and his tomb with the rich. The servant's honesty and non-violence are also mentioned. He had done no violence, and there was no deceit in his mouth. Also verse 9. As well as the fact that the servant's death seems to be voluntary. Verse 12, he poured out himself to death. But one thing above all comes across about this servant figure in the prophecies of Isaiah, and that is the servant's suffering. He is described as stricken, struck down, afflicted, wounded, crushed, punished, bruised, oppressed, cut off, anguished. And so the word we might be thinking about today is not only the word servant, but actually two words, namely the suffering servant. Suffering runs right through this passage. It is not unusual for those who seek to serve to end up suffering. I'm sure most of us come to this service today with very heavy hearts following the killing of Sir David Amess, an MP seeking to serve his Essex constituency, as he has done so for so many years, very faithfully, very cheerfully, stabbed and killed on Friday during one of his constituency surgeries. And we might also be thinking of Nazanin Zaghari Ratcliffe, a charity worker, again, somebody who wanted and who wants to serve, but now accused of plotting against the Iranian government. And sadly, the news came yesterday that her latest appeal has been quashed. In these cases, we might ask the question, what is the point of these people's suffering? Is there any good coming out of what they had to endure or what they're having to endure? And that's a question that's often asked, isn't it, on occasions, particularly when these cases happen, where people who are servants in some kind of way meet with an unjust death. There is often that question hanging around their funeral or their remembrance. You know, is there any good coming out of their suffering and their death? But you know, the answer is invariably yes. And the same is true of Isaiah's servant. Only the good coming out of his suffering seems to be on a completely different level. It seems to be of enormous consequence. Through the servant's suffering and death in Isaiah 53, the prophet mentions wholeness and healing. He mentions the prospering of God's will. He mentions the fact that many will be made righteous. He talks about the servant himself beyond death, enjoying a whole new family, enjoying light and satisfaction beyond his anguish, and being attributed all kinds of greatness and strength. This is the greatness that Jesus speaks of to James and John in our gospel reading. Only that greatness has nothing to do with status, but it has everything to do with servanthood and suffering servanthood above all. A question often on the lips of theologians, and maybe this has been a question for you at some point in your life, it's certainly been a question for me, is this: did Jesus suffer and die because of human wickedness? Or did Jesus somehow suffer and die to deal with human wickedness? Because those are two very different things. And if we're going from Isaiah chapter 53 alone, and actually our gospel reading as well, but especially Isaiah 53, it's definitely the latter. Let me refer to a few more verses. Verse 5, the prophet says, "Upon him was the punishment that made us whole, and by his bruises we are healed." Verse 6, "The Lord has laid on him the iniquity of us all." Verse 8, "He was stricken for the transgression of my people." Verse 10, "Yet it was the will of the Lord to crush him with pain when you make his life an offering for sin." Verse 11, "He shall bear their iniquities." And verse 12, "Yet he bore the sin of many and made intercession for the transgressors." It's very clear, and as unpopular as the idea is, especially in current theology, I'm thinking, for example, of Steve Chalke's pronouncements. A few years ago, he wrote a very controversial book about cosmic child abuse. As unpopular as the idea is, Jesus found himself on that cross not just as the victim of human evil, but as some kind of substitute, some kind of sacrifice, some kind of atonement, at one-ment between God and humanity. Or as Jesus himself puts it in our gospel reading, the Son of Man gave his life as a ransom for many. A ransom is a payment presumably that we could never make on our own behalf. A payment that reconciles us with God, against whom we so often rebel. But a payment that reconciles God with us also, because that reconciliation has to happen both ways. As we so often struggle in the very imperfect world in which we're placed, in the very imperfect bodies with which we have been gifted, with all the questions and anxieties and struggles of existence. Yes, God needs to be reconciled to us, as well as us to God. Yes, to some extent, we can all serve and suffer on behalf of others. In fact, Jesus calls us to this kind of life. And Remembrance Sunday, for example, which is not far away, is a perfect reminder of this. It's a perfect reminder of how people can serve and suffer on behalf of others. But the service and the suffering of Jesus, Son of Man and Son of God, was on a completely different level. It repaired once and for all an estranged relationship between God and humanity. We need to be reconciled to God in all of our imperfections. But actually, equally, God needs to be reconciled to us. As the following prayer powerfully illustrates, and it's with this prayer that I end. This is a prayer that you may have come across. It's a famous prayer from somebody dying of cancer. And it goes like this. God, you need to ask my forgiveness. Your world is full of mistakes. Some cells, like weeds in the garden, are growing in the wrong place. And we, your children, have polluted our environment. Why did you let it happen, God? We prayed with faith, hope, love. We perceived no change in our bodies or environment. We are made sick by your world. God, you need to ask my forgiveness. Was this why you sent your Son? Amen.